Okay, so welcome everyone, our members and our guests, to the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies, New South Wales, monthly lecture. Happy New Year. It's great to see everyone back for the first lecture in the year. And I'll just hand over to Ron now to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Kim, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first of our lecture series for 2025. Today's lecture is Selected History of the Rhodesian Conflict, 1970 to 79, and it will be presented by one of our members, Fabian Cohnen. Fabian served in the Rhodesian forces in that period. The period saw the whole of southern Africa in turmoil, with various countries involved in wars of independence and other power struggles. These activities were aided and abetted by many third-party players, Russia and China to name but two. And it's interesting to see that those strategic influences are still very much in play today. Fabian will give us both a strategic view and a bird's eye view of the war on the ground with the Rhodesian African Rifles. Would you please welcome Fabian to the podium?
Thank you for coming. I know that is bloody hot out there, and that was the operational area in Rhodesia in summer. Just what you experienced. I'm going to talk about brief history of Rhodesia, some strategic issues, who were the terrorist players, the fighting units and some of the equipment that they used, some tactics, and if there's sufficient time, which I think there will be, a video which gives you the look and feel of the bush war, where you're engaging the enemy at 4 meters, 5 meters tops. Then there's of course a little slide about the casualties and the consequences of the war, and any questions. The introductory slide is Ian Smith, on my left. He was a fighter pilot in North Africa and the Mediterranean in the Second World War and flew Spitfires. And he was the Prime Minister from 1965 until it was all over in 1980. The other guy there is Rhodes. And British colonialism in that era didn't want to spend any money, and Rhodes was sort of the Elon Musk of his day. Very eccentric, extremely wealthy, and the British government said, you want to form a colony of your own? You go for it, we'll give you full backing. Hence the name Rhodesia, and a small quirk, he was a gay man. And then of course you've got the Rhodesian Ridgeback, which is the only living thing that's left of Rhodesia that I can see, because you can't change a dog breed. A map of Rhodesia, to give you some orientation, is the neighbouring countries of Rhodesia all got their independence, 66, Botswana and so on. When Mozambique got its independence, it cut off Rhodesia's only link to the sea. And from that point forward, we were wholly reliant on South Africa for nearly everything. At the top of Rhodesia you see Lake Kariba, which is 220,000 kilometers in extent, and that provides hydroelectricity to all the neighboring countries, including Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe today. The pink areas is the high veld of Rhodesia, and that's where most of the farming was and most of the economic activity. The bush war was mainly fought in the brown and the yellow areas, away from the main population centres. Some stats that might be of interest. Rhodesia was only 390,000 square kilometres, and New South Wales alone is 810,000 square kilometres. So there's a bit of perspective about size. The defence budget peaked in the Vietnam War at 14% of government spend. Today it's 2%. And Rhodesia was spending towards the end of the war 40% of the government spend was on defence. So clearly there was something was going to go wrong. Population-wise, New South Wales was 5 million back then, and Rhodesia was 6.6. And white rule meant that 250,000 odd population of white people were essentially running the country with 6 million blacks. So you can imagine this was not going to end well. The Defence Force, I found from Wikipedia, peaked in Vietnam at 7,600 regulars and national service, and Rhodesia had a permanent force, regular soldiers, around about the 11,000 mark. And we'll come to the regular units and what they were a little bit later. A very brief history of how we landed in the situation with the war. The Zulus fell out with themselves in the Natal area of South Africa. They went up and tried to find their own country, and they've settled in Bulawayo. And because they're a militaristic nation, they immediately subjugated all of the tribes around them. So although they were the minority, the Shona, who is a Mugabe, they essentially kicked their ass for a good 40 years. Then Rhodes arrived with his investment package, wanting to exploit the mineral wealth in the farming area of Rhodesia, and that put a stop to Zulu incursions into other tribes. And just the Zulu name is Matabele for that tribe in Zim. The winds of change came in 1960, which I think most people in the room would remember. And Britain granted decolonization very quickly to a whole lot of nations. Nigeria was probably the worst example, where they had a civil war with Biafra, who wasn't happy with all this. So Smith said, we're not accepting this. The country's too prosperous, too well ordered. We'll go gradually into some kind of arrangement with the blacks. So they said to the UK government, essentially a finger, and said, we're declaring independence away from Britain. That, of course, prompted the whole Rhodesian Bush War, political unrest and sanctions. You know, I can remember no toilet paper, no sweets, petrol rationing, petrol coupons for those people who needed petrol. It was an extraordinary time, but that actually brought people together. And then the rest of it just spilled out. Eventually Smith in 77 said, look, we've got to accept this and we've got to accelerate it. And Lancaster House, December 79, was the peace negotiations. The UK, and I believe Australian peacekeepers arrived. I never came across a single Australian peacekeeper, but lots of British Gurkhas and parachute regiment guys came over. And then the elections, and it became black majority rule. So it was game over. There was no compromise or political settlement. The strategic issues are really interesting, but I won't dwell on them too long. Mozambique independence meant no sea. The sea line was only about 200 or 300 kilometers through Beira, they called it. The RSA at the time was doing nearly 30% of Africa's GDP, so it was, in an African context, a superpower, and they could kind of absorb this kind of punishment and support Rhodesia. They had a nuclear weapon capability that they got from Israeli and British technology that was always in the back of the mind of the US government when it was dealing with the South Africans. They were rabid anti-communists and huge Christians, and that hit all the right sort of markers in that era when it was communist versus the West, the Cold War. They wanted to protect their borders, so they had a border with Rhodesia, and they had a border in Southwest Africa with Angola. And they were prepared to do anything to keep the war away from any kind of South African territories. And of course they supported Rhodesia, and I think from memory when I lived there, the vast majority of the people that I met were Afrikaans origin. They had Dutch surnames, they spoke Afrikaans. You know, they were probably, so there were strong cultural ties between Rhodesia and South Africa, regardless of the economy. The United States in this exact period were in deep shock after Vietnam. Just like Afghanistan, they didn't see it coming. Or perhaps they did, but they were diplomatically numb. There was a Clark Amendment in '76 which meant for the first time the US were not spending money on the rebels in Angola that were keeping the Angolan rebels away from Southwest Africa, which was a South African territory. So the South Africans now had to resupply these armed bandits in the middle of nowhere with their own weapons and equipment. Rhodesia started to mess things up for the South Africans by doing cross-border raids. And there's two rare examples where they tried bombing in Angola and Tanzania with Canberra bombers. So again, the whole region was teetering on some kind of really big meltdown. Kissinger had enough, and he told the South Africans to end the Rhodesian War, cut the support, or else. So very quickly things rapidly escalated towards the end of the Rhodesian War. Russia, China, you know, people have been chasing African wealth and agriculture for as long as human history, and they're no different. There were cheap wars. They essentially gave everyone an AK-47 or an RPG, and they had a few advisors. It wasn't an expensive war to fight. The communist message was very strong: kill the whites, kill the colonists. You know, imperialism doesn't work, and of course that was just the best message for these guys who wanted to overthrow the Rhodesian government. A lot of the stuff we found was East German, Romanian, Cuban and Polish. So the Russians directly, I don't think, supplied the terrorists. It was more under the Russian sort of auspices. And the Organization of African Unity gave massive support to the liberation movements. And you had guys like a guy in Libya having a ball with this. And Nigeria was Africa's second biggest economy, and that was obviously supporting these guerrilla movements. And to top it all, in 1977, Smith was told by the Army, Police, Air Force and Intelligence Services that it was game over. And that was never revealed to me or to people probably largely in Rhodesia. So he knew he had to accelerate a political settlement despite what was going on in the war. The guys involved in this are probably well known to you, but you had on my left Joshua Nkomo, Zipra, Russian-backed, operating out of Zambia. Although they were the most effective and well-trained of the terrorist forces, they were the minority tribe. And the black majority rule, they were stuffed from the word go. But they did have to fight. And then you've got Robert Mugabe, who was largely based in Mozambique. And his lot were called Zanla. And he was from the majority Shona tribe. So if he was successful, or brought the war to a conclusion, he'd be a shoo-in as the president. And his stuff was nearly all Chinese. Everything. The ammunition that we found, the packages, the weapons, all made in China. What we had to fight these guys was the Rhodesian Light Infantry, or RLI, is probably quite well known. Whites only, because in that era, blacks didn't show enough aggression in a firefight. They couldn't shoot straight, they tended to waver. So you had to use whites in order to put it bluntly, to do the killing. So you had RLI, pure whites, They did all the fire force stuff, and we will come to that. The SAS was a white-only unit and was one of the squadrons worldwide. They had a very close relationship with the New Zealand SAS, the Australian SAS, and of course the British SAS. And they had a ball. What the SAS is designed for, they did for a good 15 years, is blow up shit everywhere surrounding Rhodesia and do all of the reconnaissance. The Rhodesian African Rifles was more my area of expertise. 3 battalions and independent companies, white officers and black other ranks. And we did fire force in the end because we started to run out of people to run these things. And patrols and ambushes. Grey Scouts, they experimented, which were horse patrols, because you had to have movement, and walking in this heat outside doesn't really work. And horses also don't really work. There's a vast expanses of Rhodesia that had tsetse flies, that had ticks, and all sorts of other diseases. But so they were only employed in certain areas. The Selous Scouts, by reputation, are always seen as the naughty boys. There was really a battalion, and they did the internal pseudo operations, and I'll come to a bit about what that means. And they, of course, did cross-border ops. The Rhodesia Regiment is probably the largest of all these forces by far. And what you did is, after you finished in the RLI, the SAS, or the Selous Scouts, and you went back to civilian life, you had a call-up system in Rhodesia where all whites had 6 weeks on the job and 6 weeks in the bush. And that was a constant year in, year out commitment for everybody. And even people in their 70s were given a wooden baton and a police reserve uniform, and they could patrol the suburbs. So everybody was involved unless you're missing a leg or something of that nature. And the Rhodesia Regiment was almost indefinable because it depended who was being called up on the day and who was going back home. There was a constant switching of forces. And the police had this Part 2 unit, police anti-terrorists, and they could conduct their own operations against the terrorists, and they tended to support the army in operations. But it was a fully functional military force. And the police, with 7,000 members and, kid you not, 19,000 reservists of all types, including Dad's army, suffered the most casualties during the Bush War, not the army. The vehicle types that the army used were Mercedes-Benz chassis rebuilt in all tonnage. We had 2.5s, 4.5s, 7.5s of tons for the landmine protection, because there were landmines everywhere. It was the easiest things for the terrorists to do. And they became world leaders. A lot of these vehicles have got laminated conveyor belting inside, which we pioneered. That stops the shock of a landmine blast. That can also stop a bullet, providing there's enough layers. So there was a whole lot of innovation going on how to deploy into the Rhodesian bush to get these guys in a protected vehicle. Of interest, the sort of chubby guy, he was the Premier of Bavaria, Hans Martin Schleyer. And he took a great shine to Rhodesia. He loved Rhodesia, he loved what Rhodesia stood for. And he gave us all these Mercedes-Benz chassis. In the early 70s, we suddenly got all this equipment out of nowhere, because everything else was falling to pieces. The old Bedford trucks from the Second World War were being used prior to us getting this kit. And because Bavaria is a semi-independent state in Germany, he could get away with this. You'll notice there's 2 tanks there, and really late in the war, Zambia had enough Russian equipment in order to send an armoured column over. And we knew this, and we thought, where the hell are we going to buy a tank? Because Africans were having none of it. So Idi Amin got kicked out in '79 in the war with Tanzania, and on the docks at Dar es Salaam were 4 T-54s he'd paid for that were just sitting there. And of course intelligence is intelligence, so we picked up they're sitting there. We asked the South Africans to buy them from the Tanzanians. Then they were shipped to South Africa, and then they came up to us. So where there's money involved, anything's possible in Africa. But they didn't come with enough ammunition. We mainly were sitting there shooting blanks, just playing with them. If it had the fan in a serious way, I don't think there would have been much use. But the publicity was big that we had tanks. And the Air Force was a sight to behold. We had complete air superiority, but, this stuff was vintage Second World War or shortly after, and we were limited with spare parts. Who could service these things in the long term? And the most valuable piece of assets there was the Alouette helicopter, which could take 4 fully armed troops, and that was the limit of the helicopter carrying capacity of the Rhodesian Army. Only when the South Africans helped us, we managed to get some Pumas that could ship 15, 16 fully armed soldiers. These would all be familiar to the Australian Defence Forces way back in the 50s and 60s. The Dakota, which we call the Vomit Comet, was widely used in Fire Force, but because of its altitude restrictions, you were bouncing like a bouncing Betty in the sky. They were bloody awful, and you couldn't hear yourself think inside them. A few insights into the sort of practical aspects of being in the military. Around about 70% of all Defence Force personnel were black, fighting for a minority white government, which is a bit weird. And there's a picture of a whole lot of Selous scouts, and there's not a white man among them, right? National service was there to bolster the military, and the minute you finished national service, you went straight to Rhodesia Regiment, and you were 6 weeks in, 6 weeks out, and so on and so forth. Just the emphasis that even if you were a national serviceman and you thought you could do the SAS selection, you're welcome. There was no barriers to entry. Selection techniques, for me personally, they shipped us off in the end of '79 to the police grounds in Salisbury, and they said, right, start running, and there was a big rugby field. So all of us didn't know what to do, we were all terrified, and so we started running. And the selection was the first people that dropped out, pay corps. The next people that dropped out, maybe medical. And so it went on until they fleeced out. The last people standing, infantry. And that was it. It wasn't very sophisticated. They didn't ask you what your degrees were or your high school accreditation. But we all knew this because everybody was called up. So all of the people around us were either in the army, on call up, or came back to school to tell us what was going on. Then when I finished that, I made it to the infantry, because that's where you get all the hot women. Then, at the RLI, they said, oh yeah, come on. And they gave us, they had groves of trees, maybe 8 groves of trees. They give you 2 bricks, and they say, start running. That was it. We ran for hours on end around these trees, and then if you were still alive at the end of that, they said, right, do the assault course, because they had one next door to the grove of trees. And if you did that, you were in the training troop of RLI. But they didn't care what you looked like as long as you could run. and operate in a temperature that's akin to what's outside. That's very critical. Foreign recruitment was rampant. In my battalion, the 2IC was a Kiwi, and the company commanders were Scots, Australian, Austrian and German. They didn't care what your passport was. They didn't care if you were a citizen or not. And a lot of the guys had a genuine interest in seeing active service, because a lot of them were a long time in peacekeeping armies without any military deployment. And the most typical thing that happened was you'd have a Brit who was, say, an acting temporary captain in a peacetime army whose substantive rank was a lieutenant. He was buggered. There's no way he's going to promote his career unless he sits forever. What the Rhodesian Army did, they said, okay, let's assess you, and they gave them substantive ranks in the Rhodesian Army of, say, a major, if he was up for it. And that was the enticement. That and the life in Rhodesia was very attractive. So we had some real adventurers, real, sometimes crazy characters, but essentially they all wanted to be there and they wanted to participate in the war. The Australian was my battalion commander, and he was an ex-copper from New South Wales. So I don't know how that all worked out, but he was a major. The territorial army system of this call-up 6 weeks in, 6 weeks out, led to an awful social impact. There was just no peace for these people. They weren't expected to deploy in a fire force role. It was mainly patrolling. It was debilitating work. If you saw action, it would be over in a couple of seconds. And Rhodesia had the highest divorce rate behind Israel in that time, because families were just falling to pieces. And then around about 78, black NCOs were made officers, and that was a big breakthrough in the Rhodesian Army system. You get WO1s, WO2s, and sergeants were made lieutenants, sometimes captains as adjutants, that sort of thing. But we were rapidly running out of white people to run this thing. What we did in its broadest sense was we had protected villages, which became a bit of a standing joke, because the terrorists out in the bush in the day used to come back there and sleep and eat and then go back out again and attempt to attack us. But what do? You can't tell one from the other. It was exactly the same as Vietnam. The deterrence patrols and ambushes that we laid had minimum effectiveness, because, you know, how many, you got like 4 or 5 people walking through the bush in Rhodesia, it's very unlikely you're going to come across anything. So they were long, they were monotonous, and not that effective. Because of the helicopter capacity, the army defaulted to a 4-man stick, because 4 blokes could get in a helicopter in an emergency or be medevaced out if they were all shot. And that was always the same sort of combination. You had a guy who was a medic and a rifleman. You had a MAG gunner, who was always the strongest and the biggest, and 2 riflemen. And inevitably, they were led by a corporal. And we were taught at the School of Infantry, this is a corporal's war. It was a corporal that made the decisions, that triggered the firefights, that essentially did everything. Internal clandestine operations, you wanted to establish OPs so that you could scan the environment. But because the terrorists operated in heavily populated black areas, like tribal trust lands, to have white guys running around, you know, was ridiculous. They knew immediately that there was something going on. Black troops are much more effective, and of course they were nearly 70% of what was out there. But even them, sitting there in the Rhodesian Army uniforms, you know, would find it very difficult to surprise anybody. And the Mujiba, that was our word for little black kids who were herding cattle. And the terrorists trained them to look for anything, anywhere that was suspicious. And these little buggers were very, very effective at compromising operations. Convoys became the norm. You couldn't free ride anywhere unless you had a lot of guts. Engineers would clean up a road and then you'd have your convoy, both civilian and military, not just military. This fire force, which we'll come to, was the most effective deployment of resources, because once you spot a group of terrorists, either by OP or some sort of intelligence, you could direct your fire right on them. And you didn't have to chase them around the bush in long-winded patrols. The Selous Scouts became effective because they created these frozen areas. So we'd be operating in call it a tribal trust land, which was allocated to blacks, and we get a signal to say, get out of there, and there'd be boundaries. And the police, military, everybody else would leave, and then the Selous Scouts would deploy in there and try and catch what was there. And their techniques, we just walked away. It was nothing to do with the mainstream military. But they had to be ruthless to actually get these guys and to find them. And Selous Scouts had a lot of turned terrorists in their ranks, so they could naturally kind of fit into the environment, deal with the locals, and search through to kill them. A white guy walking in there was a waste of space. Cross-border ops became very interesting because they thought by being in Mozambique or Zambia, international rules would apply. So the camps were really close to Rhodesia, and we were aware of the camps, we knew exactly what was going on there, and I'll come to that tactic in a minute. We also created basically a terrorist organization called RENAMO that kept the Mozambican government off kilter. The SAS trained them and led them, and they would disrupt everything in Mozambique they possibly could to keep the Mozambique government away from the terrorists so we could kill them. And I'll come to that in a bit too. If a black guy could dob in a terrorist leader, what was that? $2,500 reward, and the average black wage was $600 at the time. So to create just a financial incentive to where these buggers are was actually quite strong. Talk about the fire force, and a video coming up will describe it to an extent. Helicopter-borne troops that are obviously helicoptered in. Normally you have one K car which had the 20mm cannon, and it would have a major on board or similar rank. He would manage the operation, airborne. And you had 3 troop-carrying helicopters. So you had 12 guys on the ground in a typical fire force operation, which sounds comical, but we didn't have that many helicopters. Lynx would come in as support, and that would have cannon fire and also drop bombs. But a 20mm cannon shell will not explode in soft ground, and often these guys would be operating during rainy season, so you can shoot as many cannon shells as you like, and all you're doing is you're just dropping them in. And if it hits a rock, the shell of course will explode, but then it won't harm the terrorists. Other units in the areas would act as stop groups. Often they'd be Rhodesia Regiment guys on call-ups, they'd be radioed in, and they would lay ambushes along the general perimeter, because these guys would scatter, and they'd walk into these stop groups that were put all over the place. These 12 guys who operated in fire force, most of the time Just got in a sweep line, MAGs on either ends, because then you've got that great sweep of fire, and just walk. And you were watching for what was popping up in front of you at 5 meters distance, 4 meters distance. So the courage of these RLI guys is actually extraordinary, and they did it again and again and again. This Des Archer guy still got the world record for operational jumps. As the war continued, you went from groups of 7 to say 15 terrorists to 50 to 100. 12 guys on the ground couldn't take that on, so they adopted parachuting as a backup. So a fire force would have a decoder attached to it, maybe 2, and these guys would be parachuted in to act as stop groups or support for the guys that are on the ground. They required administrative tail. When those helicopters went, immediately the trucks went with fuel drums, ammunition, more troops if possible, to support what was going on there. And by 79, these guys were getting called out 3 or 4 times a day, having contact with 50 to 100 terrorists. And they did it. And they shot them. When you look back, you think it's pretty incredible what the RLI was doing, and the RAR. The terrorist tactics, you know, they were terrified of these helicopter-borne things. They were terrified of aerial fire. They scattered mainly. And of course, as things went on, they became wiser and they started shooting the helicopters out of the air. And that, you know, how do you cope with that? We only had 40. Now this was keyed up to a point in the video, wasn't it?
The kill ratio of the Rhodesian security forces operating inside the country is roughly 10 to 1. This includes men killed by landmines, in road ambushes, and those serving in low-grade defense units. However, these figures can be somewhat misleading. In straight fighting with their regular companies, the Rhodesians kill, on average, 60 or 70 guerrillas for the loss of every man. The men of this fire force have also fought inside Zambia and Mozambique. There, where the enemy is concentrated in large numbers, the end result has often been little short of wholesale slaughter. In this type of operation, the paras drop from 400 feet. Other specialist units often jump from 20,000 feet at night. The Rhodesian SAS employ the latest freefall techniques when raiding across the border. They drop for 18,000 feet before opening their chutes to avoid detection. Inside Rhodesia, there is no need for stealth, as the helicopter troops have already gone in. Once on the ground, the paras regroup as quickly as possible and advance towards a small collection of huts a few hundred yards away. Near the huts is a suspected guerrilla position, and an airstrike is called in. To get to the village, the men have to advance through a maize field. They move, as usual, in extended line, knowing that at any moment they may meet the enemy at a range of 4 or 5 yards. The guerrillas are lying hidden. The soldiers are walking upright, completely exposed to fire. Against a competent enemy, this will be suicide. Meanwhile, the helicopter troops are advancing on the guerrilla position nearby. The mixture of fear and self-control shows clearly as they move forward. In this war, the killing is done at such close range that a soldier actually sees the expression on his victim's face as he dies. A guerrilla dies. Another man dies, this time an innocent civilian. But in this war, the man who shoots first survives. In the village, the situation is very tense. The fighting continues in the maize field round about. There is an unusually large number of healthy young men in what is a small family kraal. Guerrillas often wear two sets of clothing, so the young men are stripped and checked. The huts are searched. Although the soldiers come from exactly this sort of village background, they have little sympathy for those they suspect of harbouring guerrillas. Since the war began, over 100 black soldiers have been murdered by guerrillas while visiting their families in their tribal homes. Nor are their families safe. Several of the men in this company have relatives who are guerrillas. One lance corporal knowingly and deliberately killed his own brother in a skirmish. The soldiers find definite evidence of a guerrilla presence. Every hut is stripped, and they unearth a first aid kit. Just outside the village, in a maize field, a guerrilla is killed, and his weapons are brought in. The village headman is taken to identify the body. The long-term effect on these young men of the continued killing is not yet to be seen. But the immediate conclusion must be that they are becoming indifferent to violence and insensitive to suffering. But they at least are members of a highly disciplined organization, the regular army. The youngsters fighting as guerrillas do not have the same restraints, and with them the possible psychological effects are far more worrying. Used to enforcing their demands on the population through the power of a gun, sometimes witness to or participants in extreme brutality against defenseless civilians, it is doubtful if they will ever fully adjust to the routine and comparative boredom of normal life. This problem is not confined to Rhodesia. It is a depressing feature of all guerrilla wars, which by their very nature encourage lawlessness and a bandit mentality. As the men pack up their parachutes for use on another day, they can think only of the present. Tomorrow they may not number amongst the survivors. And indeed, shortly after this, the young para-officer was shot in the throat and killed. The real horror of war is not the fear and violence on the battlefield. It is the anguish of those left behind and the agony of those who survive as physical or psychological cripples. It is the appalling waste of brave and the destruction of dreams which all of us share. For Rhodesia, the future holds despair. If white morale collapses, or the army is dismantled, there will be total chaos. Civil war will break out between Mr. Mugabe and Mr. Nkomo, and while the whites may escape, the African civilians will die in countless thousands. At least 13,000 Rhodesians on both sides have died so far. That figure could fade into insignificance.
The video goes on, but there was a look and feel about an actual... The guy who filmed this was called Lord Cecil. He was a lord, ex-British SAS. He was killed 2 weeks later in one of these situations. So it's a genuine sort of representation of what goes on. So the fire force we've covered, you get that, it's very risky. The cross-border raids became the biggest single killing machine really that Rhodesia could do. The first cross-border raid, which was totally unexpected by these terrorists, was Operation Eland. So the Salute Scouts dressed themselves up as Mozambique government soldiers. They dressed up the vehicles with Russian vehicles. There was about 6 vehicles in the convoy, and at a 8 o'clock roll call for all of the terrorists in the camp, they drove in at that time. They were let in because security was non-existent, and they opened fire, and they killed nearly 1,000 people in less than 5 minutes without a single casualty. So everybody thought, wow, this is the way to go. We don't have to deploy fire force, we don't have to have these patrols, we just kill them before they come in. But we crossed international borders to do it. Operation Dingo was a very sophisticated raid on a very large base where they killed, who knows, but they killed a lot of people there. They think 3,000 to 4,000. And that was done with Canberras, vampires, napalm, HE bombs. They used, for that particular operation, 70% of the entire chopper fleet in Rhodesia to get in the SAS and the RLI. So it was a white-only operation. And massively successful. And Forster in South Africa, realizing that the war was starting to spread across boundaries, had a heart attack. He said, you can't do this. And from that point forward, South Africa started to pull back on support. Things started to dry up. There were more petrol crises in Rhodesia, all as a result of what Smith had to do. You know, you either kill them before they come in, or you kill them in Rhodesia, which is a lot more messy. Operation Miracle was beginning of the end. We were so confident that we took on 6,000 entrenched terrorists in proper positions and trenches with anti-aircraft support. And that operation meant that we lost a Canberra, a Hunter, 2 Alouettes and 8 killed. That for Rhodesia was a devastating outcome of one of these operations. And Frelimo tried to intervene. So Renamo, who were sort of trying to keep them away, it didn't work. They came with tanks, and the SAS took them out with all sorts of equipment. But that told Smith and the Rhodesian government and the Rhodesian military that the fun times are over. This was going to be a hard war, and we're going to lose a lot of people doing it. We experimented with Zambia, and the most famous one is Green Leader. And if you haven't seen the YouTube of Green Leader, please see it. It's an actual operation dropping bombs on a massive terrorist camp in Zambia. It's about 15 minutes. The Zambians, again, were entirely surprised by this thing, and we closed Zambian airspace for about 10 minutes while the raid was going in. So all international flights were diverted. And then the SAS tried to get in Como in Zambia. He was the leader from the Matabele. They identified his house in this affluent middle-class suburb of Lusaka. The SAS choppered in there. The equivalent of flying into Marrickville, did stop groups around. All the civilians were coming out of their houses, taking pictures, whilst these guys were sitting in ditches playing soldiers. And of course he wasn't there. But they got intelligence. They had to chop her out at basically floor level out of Lusaka to avoid getting shot at. And one of the SAS guys threw in a bunker bomb in order to destroy the house completely. And he forgot that African houses are normally only built 1 brick thick. So the wall fell on him. And that was the only casualty of that raid. What the terrorists were up to is, I think, fairly obvious. Infiltrating with small units, so you couldn't get many of them at one point. They bombed Woolworths and several other places, but Woolworths was a good example. They shot down 2 Viscounts, which were they were taking tourists to Lake Kariba. And how they got these RPG-7s, is it? The anti-aircraft things. The Russians gave them the stuff in order to try and stop the war quickly. And one of the Viscounts went down, and 18 people were staggering around who actually survived the impact. And they were all murdered next to the aeroplane. And that knocked the stuffing out of Rhodesia in terms of morale, those incidents. And I don't think we ever recovered from that. You know, they had lots of missions everywhere in the Rhodesian bush. You know, they'd regularly shoot missionaries, white missionaries, you know, that sort of thing. They blew up the fuel tanks at Salisbury Airport, which is, these things were massive, as you can imagine, completely undefended. It was and eventually they got them, boom. And we couldn't put the fire out because we didn't have the firefighting equipment. So the South Africans sent up via Hercules planes, which we didn't have, these fire trucks from Jan Smuts Airport in Johannesburg to put the fires out. They regularly murdered white and black farmers. You know, that's a whole topic on its own. They destroyed local governance. The whole headman, chief kind of system was totally taken out. And they would target military and police on leave. And a lot of the casualties that you see right at the end on casualty lists were just guys on leave at home. They weren't actually engaging the terrorists directly. Intimidation and the whole communist playbook. That badge there, kill your landlord, you know, they would wear. And of course they generally avoided contact with security forces if they could, because otherwise they'd be taken out. The last piece of the puzzle happened sort of in my era. During the peacekeeping talks, which took a long time, Mugabe strongly suspected his head of military was starting to cozy up with General Walls, who was head of the Rhodesian Army. So Mugabe had him taken out because he wanted to win this and he wanted to be president. And Tongogara, whatever, he was a big featured man in the whole political movement. He brought in North Koreans, and a North Korean took out my appendix when it burst. And they led and supervised Mugabe's sort of fallback force, which is a whole brigade of very loyal tribal guys, in case it all went pear-shaped later on, after the elections. Joshua Nkomo, who's the guy featured, the chubby guy, at that point he knew under free and fair elections he was out. His whole movement was gone, and the Matabele people were going to get the stuffing knocked out of them. And that's actually what happened post-independence. So we came up with 2 ops. Op Hectic, kill Mugabe and Nkomo. And while I was at School of Infantry, we were rehearsing for Operation Quartz, because all of the terrorists were put in the assembly points towards the end of the war where they could be fed and paid. And we had, given where the Air Force was at and if everybody was called up, we thought we could take them all out. But of course by then, Bob Mugabe had been endorsed by Thatcher and the American president, and it was too late. We couldn't possibly turn the clock back. But we had serious thoughts about it. The casualties are 53% of all military casualties were police, internal affairs, who were really just there administering black tribal lands, and the Rhodesia Regiment, which was this continuous call-up mob. Call it a dad's army for want of a better word. The actual military that I belonged to, our casualties were extremely light because we knew, what we were doing. The estimates, and these are just estimates, around about 30,000 people died during the Bush War. The military lost about 2,500. That's what I was with. SADF lost a few. And farmers, 234 farmers were killed. Farmers were given security fencing, they were given machine guns, they were given all the assistance possible. Even landmine protected vehicles were given by the government to farmers. And somehow they kept going. It's absolutely astonishing what the human being can do. And of course, we killed an awful lot of crossfires. That's civilians who get caught up in the war because the terrorists weren't idiots. They would always go to a village, and you saw in the video, something pops out in front of you, you kill it immediately. You don't care if it's a woman, man, because you don't know. They're all covered in the foliage. Zimbabwe, those potholes in Bulawayo, tells you a little bit what it's like there now. The commercial farmers were largely kicked out, and the tragedy behind it is it was kicked out for people who were subsistence farmers. So commercial farming kind of came to an end, created food shortages in a place that shouldn't have food shortages. And that newspaper article is about how the Shonas, after being dominated by these Matabele guys, took their own back and largely impoverished that part of Zimbabwe that's around Bulawayo. And that's the end of my talk. There is some photos there of me doing my thing, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Drill Head Sherman RUSI, you mentioned that a number of black NCOs became officers. What was the educational level of the black NCOs who became black officers?
Extremely low. And that's why they often were put either in... the army gave them an education. When black soldiers came into the military, they'd go through a schooling system, they'd be taught English, how to write, how to read, and things like that. So it wasn't too bad, but it was nowhere near the standard of a white guy who'd been through the school system. In my experience, they had roles all over the place. They didn't become majors that much and tended to go into, like I said, adjutant jobs to relieve other officers who could go into the front. But generally speaking, quite poor. There's a whole story about the Rhodesian education system. And to be frank, they spent an absolute fortune on the whites and almost nothing on the blacks. And it was only through missionaries, church. Mugabe was educated very well at a Catholic missionary. They took up the slack that the Rhodesian government simply didn't have the resources to. So I had a fantastic education system, to me. That was a general problem, this lack of education. Does that give you an idea? Yeah.
Great talk, I've learned so much, thank you. Maybe you had a diagram there of casualty counts. Can you tell us a little bit about British South Africa Police and why their casualty rates were even higher than the RLI?
As the Bush War developed and it became a free-for-all, the police didn't have military training. They had a civilian role, they were semi-military, they still carried FN rifles and things like that, but they weren't soldiers. And they were just a picking point for the terrorists. They loved them. They'd run around in unprotected Land Rovers. They would be part of the local community, the constables, the black constables. They'd be out in the bush. And from being friendly to the civilians or being well accepted to the civilians for years, they get their throats cut. These guys didn't die in formal military operations. They died just being picked off, and it's an absolute tragedy.
Hello, Murray, RUSI member. You described the opponents in this war as terrorists. From the description of the activities undertaken, it sounds like a classic counterinsurgency campaign. So alternatively, you could have called them insurgents. I'm just very curious, do you feel as a counterinsurgency campaign that you were always going to lose it? Did you have a sense that any of the tactics that you employed had added to the body of knowledge about how to deal with insurgents? And did you feel any of those tactics may have led you to eventually be winning if there was that political will to continue?
Yeah, great question. The formal usage in the Rhodesian Army for these guys is a CT, it's a communist terrorist. That was used universally by all security forces. Were we ever going to win this thing? No. What Smith was trying to do is negotiate himself out of black majority rule. He didn't want the country to fall to pieces, and that was a common feeling for white people in Rhodesia. Yes, we accept majority rule, or we accept black rule of some kind, but not so it completely disenfranchises the white man. After all, we built up the country to a point where it was fairly prosperous in an African context. So the whole war was going on almost in the hope that the end settlement would be more fair. And we didn't know what the end settlement was until clearly the military situation had got out of hand. So up till the end of '79, no matter what the CTs threw at us, we could deal with that effortlessly. But the morale was slipping, we had shortages of manpower, the equipment was falling to pieces. So we said, Smith, please get us out of the shit, really. And in the end, he couldn't. And that was the end. It was all about living there and experiencing the atmosphere to try and explain why the war lasted so long. Because it was white minority rule. When you look back on it, it looks ridiculous. 250,000 white people trying to control 6 million. It worked for a long time, but it had to come to an end. So it was the hope of getting a fair settlement. It all went pear-shaped, didn't it? Yeah.
Chris Bolton, RUSI member, can you tell us at the end your personal story, how you recovered your situation?
How did I recover? I finished off with this RLI thing, and then I went into RAR, and we became the focal point for reintegrating the CTs into the regular army. So I worked with the British military, and we tried to bring them in, to retrain them and to amalgamate them with the RAR black troops. In 1,100 people in my battalion, there were 7 whites, and one of them was me. So the whole idea was that the black guys would accept their black guys and it would work. And we kind of oversaw that in dribs and drabs with a lot of dramas. And I left when the last white guy left, and I felt lonely. I thought, no, I got out of there. I'd signed on because I went on the regular officers course. I was a permanent member, so I saw 2.5 years through and then left because, there was nothing in it for me anymore. It was just seeing the army go to the dogs. We had a proud military tradition, and in the end it was just the CTs were amalgamated in the army, number one, to earn a salary. They had no interest in being there. All they did was create shit, basically, and control that daily would, wear anybody out. And the Brits all thought it was funny. They had no appreciation of what had gone on before. But in a very strange way, over the long term it worked. Africans have short memories, in my experience. You can put them through extreme stress, you can put them through the worst nightmares you can think of. And the next month, they're laughing, joking, and they're talking to the pals they were trying to shoot, 6 months before. It's very strange. It's not something that we can quite comprehend.
I struck exactly that during the Rwanda emergency.
Yeah. Yeah.
Enemy and foe, putting into a soup.
Yep.
Yeah. They sliced each other up with machetes.
Yeah. The next day they kind of, oh, okay, what happened? I don't think they get PTSD. I don't think. Not in my experience. Anyway, we went through that. The strangest things happened, but overall it was, you just saw the slow decline of what was a really effective fighting force into really just rubbish. So that was it.
General James Mattis once said, "We've been fighting on this planet for 5,000 years, and we do ourselves and our soldiers a great disservice if we don't look back into the past and see what happened." I can remember doing work for Field Force Command back in the 1980s, where I think we proved that about 300 to 500 hardcore, well-trained guerrillas, regardless of where they came from, could tie down the entire Australian Regular Army in Northern Australia. It's important that each year we have this historical presentation looking at something from the past. I think as time goes on, the Rhodesian and the South African situation offer us two distinct lessons which have been brought out by Fabian today. Lesson number one is a lesson of conducting a bush war, regardless of the background. Lesson number two is that we ignore Southern Africa at our peril. Every year, Russia and China conduct exercises with the South African Navy. The Australian press doesn't consider it worthy of even reporting it. Yet the Cape of Good Hope is our supply route to the rest of the world. So Fabian, I think you've drawn to our attention today a number of very key issues, and I, for one, was absolutely fascinated with both your presentation and your resoluteness to stick to the truth. And I think this is fantastic, and I would like to thank you and present you with a gift for your presentation today.
Thank you.
And I understand that Diana, one of our board members, will be in contact with you to write a monograph on this matter for the Javelin Monograph series. Thanks very much.
All right.